Ever since Descartes proclaimed, "I think, therefore I am," consciousness has been regarded as the most fundamental aspect of existence. After all, no consciousness, nobody around to notice the rest of the world. But what is consciousness, and how has it evolved? Do minds really exist, or are they just a byproduct of language? Paul, let's continue exploring mysteries. In last week's exciting episode, we were talking about time, which is something that people feel innately. They feel the passage of time. The other mystery that I think people feel is their own existence. They're conscious of their consciousness. They're aware of being alive. And it may be that we are unique in this ability. What can the physicist tell us about consciousness?
I think from the point of view of the physicist, consciousness is a very mysterious phenomenon. First of all, we'd like to know what consciousness is for, what role it plays in nature. And secondly, how does it arise? There's a whole set of problems called the mind-body problem. And that's best explained in the following way, that again, from the physicist's point of view, the mystery is this, that I think thoughts, I have ideas, emotions, impressions, sensations, and I can respond to these in a very obvious way just by moving parts of my body. So, for example, if I'd like to raise my arm obligingly goes up. Now, how can thoughts do that? How can the mental activity, I would like to raise my arm, be turned into the physical activity of the arm moving? Well, we can sort of trace back a chain of command, can't we? We can see that there are nerve impulses that go to the muscles of my arm, and these nerve impulses originate in electrical activity in my brain and so on. But what is it that just triggers all that chain of command? How is it that a thought can be translated into electrons moving down nerves and so on? So that's one side of the problem, how thoughts can move matter. The other side of the problem is how is it that when, for example, light strikes my eye and turns into an electrical impulse in my nerve cells, in the optic nerve, and then again those signals, there's a chain of command, they get amplified and enter my brain, and patterns of electrical activity swirl around in my brain. How can those patterns of electrical activity create thoughts? So what we're trying to do here is to fit together the mental world, the world of ideas, thoughts, emotions, sensations, with the physical world, the world of electrons moving according to the laws of physics, and arms that can be moved according to electrical activity. How can we fit these together? That's the problem.
Paul, I'm aware that almost every branch of science seems to be attacking the problem of consciousness. There's a profusion of books and theories coming out. Where are you physicists?
Floundering around, I think. There are some scientists who think that consciousness is such a problem it's best defined away. Let's sweep it under the carpet. Let's say consciousness doesn't really exist. We only imagine it exists. We hallucinate our own existence. That thoughts can't move electrons or arms or whatever. And so there's a tendency to try to define the problem away like this and say that the human body and the human brain is just a very complicated machine doing what all machines do, which is slavishly complying with the laws of physics. And that if we knew enough about what's going on in my head, you could predict precisely what I'm going to do. And so any notion of there being a self in here, having a certain will and wanting to move an arm and so on, just disappears, that I just become a very complicated machine. So there's a tendency to try to define the problem away like that.
Sorry, that's not acceptable in this context. You'll have to do better than that.
It seems not acceptable just because our most primitive experience is of our own existence, that we can directly see that we exist, we know that we exist. And whilst I can't be absolutely sure that there's anybody at home over there, any conscious being inside Philip Adams, whilst I can't be sure that you are not some incredibly cleverly programmed automaton, just a zombie, I do nevertheless know that I am not a cleverly programmed automaton.
Yeah, but I don't know that.
No, that's right.
Yes.
So the problem here is that we infer the existence of other minds, of other consciousnesses, by analogy, that you behave in a manner similar to me, and if I stamp on your toe and you scream, I imagine that you feel pain, even though we know...
But that's preordained by the laws of physics, isn't it, that one?
Well, we know that what's preordained by the laws of physics are the nerve impulses and the other activity going on in your brain, but the actual feeling part, physics doesn't seem to be able to tell us about.
Well, let's get back to the question that you raised earlier. What purpose does consciousness have? What is its advantage?
Well, this is the mystery if we try and define it away, because why is it there at all? In other words, if a cleverly programmed automaton or a zombie that had evolved to fulfill a lot of complicated functions can get by in the world without being conscious of its own existence, what is the purpose of us having this consciousness, or this self-consciousness, this self-awareness? It does seem to be a mystery if it doesn't fulfill any role. So I think we have to take consciousness seriously, in spite of the fact that many scientists would like to do away with it.
Well, let's flip it over a bit and look at it from another viewpoint, a non-scientific viewpoint. It's clearly a very sharp two-edged sword, because while consciousness appears to be efficacious in dealing with environmental problems, it also gives us terrible problems. It gives us an awareness of our own mortality. It gives us suffering as well as joy, doesn't it? It's not an unalloyed pleasure to have consciousness.
No, indeed not. A lot of people try to argue that human beings are the only ones who are fully aware of their own existence and indeed their own mortality. It's very hard to say when we look at animals. If, for example, you have a cat or a dog, it's very tempting to suppose that they're fully conscious of their own existence, and when the dog chases after a rabbit or digs up a bone, that it's got some internal representation of the world that involves things like purposes. I would like to get at that bone and I'm going to go out and dig it up and so on. But there are other examples when we look at animal behaviour where it seems to be, as some people like to say, purely instinctual, that the animal is behaving in a certain way like an automaton, without seemingly being aware of what it's doing.
But you'd have to extend that to many of our own activities as human beings.
Yes, that's right.
Wouldn't
We, in fact, most of the things we do in life, we don't really give a thought to. We wander around. We can often...
Or driving a car becomes an acquired skill where...
I found an extraordinary thing when our children were small, that I could sit there of an evening and read a story to them. And the words would all come out right, including the inflection. The whole thing would make sense. And yet I wasn't taking any of it in because I was thinking about some physics problem. And so one part of our brain can process information in this way, whilst another part is doing something else. So you can't tell just from the behaviour of something, however clever it might appear to be, that there's somebody at home, that there's something going on inside, that there really is mental activity.
Let's accept it. Let's presume that it's real. Can you deduce some practical evolutionary purpose for our degree of consciousness?
It's easy to use consciousness-type language to see an advantage. For example, it clearly is advantageous to be able to predict the future to a limited extent and to plan. So supposing we were trapped here in this very hostile environment and it would be necessary to find water, we might want to say, well, you look over there and I'll look over here, and we'll meet up again at the hill over there this time tomorrow. In order to make those sorts of plans, to have that type of social activity, to be able to think ahead, you need to have some concept of your own existence and the existence of others and durations of time and so on. So looking at it in the way that we do when we make such plans in daily life, it seems to be a very useful thing. But then we can see other animals that the biologists tell us wouldn't have anything near such a developed sense of consciousness, doing similar things. Birds migrating, for example.
Or a lion pack attacking.
Exactly.
The way they coordinate their activities.
So it's very hard to know where consciousness actually comes in.
Both of us enjoy from time to time reading Oliver Sacks' works. And one of his case studies concerns someone who, because of brain damage, lives in a constant now.
Yes, it's quite clear that the nature of consciousness, or let me phrase it slightly differently, the nature of selfhood and the nature of time are very closely interwoven, and I don't think we'll solve the one problem without solving the other. because when we talk about the self as an entity, what we mean is something that is preserved through time. It's a very curious thing about the self, that it is a paradoxical mixture of something which is unchanged and continuing, and yet something that changes with time. If you ask, am I the same person as I was at the age of 10? Well, in one sense you are. There's a continuity of memory and so on, and certain personality traits and so on would be unchanged. On the other hand, you're clearly not the same person, because not only has your body changed, but your mind has changed as well. So there's something that we like to call the self, which is preserved through time, and yet it's a changing thing as well. And so I don't think we're ever going to understand what we mean by the self without understanding this notion of
And conversely, with Alzheimer's,
temporality.
With Alzheimer's, we often observe the person's physicality, even some vestige of personality traits, but the self gradually evaporates.
So it would appear. And it's quite clear that consciousness, selfhood, mental activity is very intimately connected with the electrical activity, electrochemical activity in the brain. There are people who adhere to a point of view called panpsychism, which says that somehow consciousness is spread throughout the whole universe, that every little particle of matter, every atom is a little bit conscious, and that all that's happening in the brain is that somehow the assemblage of matter is amplifying this consciousness, which is present in everything. Even a rock is a little bit conscious, and therefore this, I think, gives some people a sort of respect for the environment, Mother Earth, the universe.
What's the basis of many an animist faith? If we were in Indonesia or Bali, people would literally believe that tree, that rock,
they've
to have
got some sort of consciousness, maybe rudimentary consciousness. I think it's a load of nonsense, frankly, from the scientific point of view. I think consciousness is associated with complexity, and the brain is an exceedingly complex system, and I think when matter and energy are organised to a certain level of complexity, then consciousness emerges. And so it is entirely possible, although I don't know the answer to this, that human beings are unique in having the required level of complexity for full self-awareness to emerge.
Well, could we replicate down the track this level of complexity in our gizmos? Will we achieve, do you imagine, a genuine artificial consciousness to go with AI?
A lot of people think that if we get sufficiently advanced computer, that computer could be conscious and it could have wishes and hopes and fears and feelings and so on. I'm sceptical that the sort of devices that we call computers at the moment actually can achieve consciousness. However, it's perfectly clear to me that if consciousness is associated with complex brain activity, swirling electrical patterns and so on, that we could in principle build a system that would be conscious. It's quite obvious, for example, that if we could map your body and brain to a sufficient level of detail and build a replica over here, then we'd have something that's conscious. That we can just, atom by atom, rebuild Philip Adams, we build something that's conscious. It's very important to realise, you see, that every atom in your body, pluck a carbon atom out of your brain, for example, it's identical to a carbon atom, in a lump of wood down there, or a carbon atom in the sun, or whatever. Carbon atoms are all identical, so there's nothing special about the stuff of which you're made. It's the way it's put together that is the key point here. So it is the complex organisation of the matter that gives rise to consciousness, not the actual material of which you are made. And there's this old concept of the ghost in the machine. It goes back to René Descartes. And the idea there is that there are two kinds of substance in the world. There's the good old sort of concrete stuff of the soil. There's matter, and there's mind stuff as well. And Descartes had this idea that our bodies and brains are just like machines, like a car, for example, and that the mind somehow attaches itself to this vehicle and steers it, just a bit like the way in which the driver steers a car. And this was the ghost in the machine. And this type of imagery, that a human being consists of two bits of a body and, if you like, a soul, and the soul is some sort of nebulous substance that attaches itself to your head or floats just above your head or something. This type of imagery I think has taken root, and a lot of popular conceptions of the soul in religion, I think, derive from this Cartesian, or the view of Descartes.
Except that, of course, those theologies tend to remove the ghost from the machine entirely, and you can have the ghost minus the machine, or independent from the machine. After the machine is dead, the ghost goes on.
That's the appeal of this ghost in the machine imagery, that when the machine dies, the ghost can float away to somewhere else. But I might say that that notion of the self or the soul or the mind as some sort of nebulous substance that attaches itself to a body is not an idea that has a long history in religion. You can't find those sorts of references in the Bible. It's really an invention of Descartes, and it's not an idea that makes very much sense at all in modern science. It's often called the dualist theory of the mind. Dualist because it requires two types of thing: matter, bodies, and minds, some separate type of substance. And of course it doesn't solve any problems, because you see, if you're trying to explain the mind, if you're trying to explain why the machine behaves in the way it does, in terms of referring to the driver of the machine, the ghost in the machine, you're just pushing back the problem, because you then have to explain how the ghost works. What laws does the ghost
and you also have to explain the enormous variety of ghosts in apparently similar machines. One ghost writes Hamlet. Yes. Another ghost comes up with E equals MC squared.
More of a problem, where do these ghosts come from? You know, who supplies them, and how do they glue themselves onto the machine? The really major problem in this dualist or Cartesian view of the ghost in the machine is this, that seeing as this mind stuff is not something which we want to think of as extended in space. It's not something that have a location in space. How can this mind stuff move electrons in people's brains at specific points in space? How is it that an electron moving along a certain trajectory in a brain cell in my brain can be nudged to one side by this nebulous stuff called mind, which isn't anywhere? It's not actually sort of located at a particular point in space, and it doesn't have sharply defined boundaries or a shape or a size or anything of that sort. So this whole view really fell apart, because no convincing explanation could be given of the interaction between the mind and the brain. And so at this particular stage, I think I would make the following 2 points. That I think we have to take consciousness seriously. I think it is something that really exists and has a real role to play. It's not just an illusion, not something we can sweep under the carpet. And B, we really don't know, on the basis of our present understanding of physics, how it works, or how consciousness connects to matter in any very convincing way.
Is there not another problem, too, about consciousness, which gets us into the difficulty of the observer and the observed?
In a way, the problem of the observer and the observed is the oldest problem of philosophy and indeed of science. For most of the history of science, the observer was pushed out of the picture. In Newton's physics, for example, the observer is just an onlooker, just that. That although in practice, of course, every time we make an observation of the world, we inevitably interact with it, interfere with it, disturb it in some way. In Newton's scheme, this can be reduced to as little as you like. Let me just give you a simple example. Supposing I want to measure the temperature of a glass of water. Put the thermometer into the glass of water and wait for a little bit and read off the temperature. Well, the act of putting the thermometer in the water will change the very temperature I'm trying to measure. Now, in the old-fashioned way of looking at physics, it was always possible to imagine a very refined experiment in which you could either reduce this disturbance to something of negligible proportions, or you could cleverly allow for it in your results. But then in the early part of this century, our entire view of nature was transformed with something called quantum physics or quantum mechanics. And the essence of quantum mechanics is there is an irreducible disturbance that takes place whenever a microscopic system is observed. And by a microscopic system, I mean something of atomic or molecular proportions. So down at the level of atoms and molecules, the very act of observation disturbs a system in a way that simply cannot be reduced to zero. it is something which is irretrievably part of the measurement process. So the observer and the observed become entangled, intertwined, in a way that is just irreducible. And so we're presented with a major problem, but a major opportunity. And the major opportunity is that here for the first time we see notions of observation equals mind entering in physics at a very fundamental level. So this is the loophole that could just provide the clue to explaining consciousness within the scope of physics.
Penrose, who is someone with whom you agree and disagree quite passionately, has argued that quantum physics acts in the brain.
Yes, that's
and
right.
is somehow creating consciousness.
That's right. Now, there is, of course, a danger in saying that quantum mechanics explains consciousness by using the following argument, that the act of observation in quantum mechanics is a mystery. Consciousness is a mystery, and therefore one mystery explains the other. It could just be that we've got two quite separate mysteries, but it makes some sense to explore the way in which quantum physics might have a role to play in the brain. Now, at first sight, this doesn't seem very promising, because the brain is a pretty big thing compared to the size of an atom. Even individual neurons in the brain are enormous compared to atomic and molecular dimensions. So it seems very hard to see how quantum effects, which are very prominent at the atomic level, can have any effect at all at the level of neurons, still less macroscopic patterns swirling around in the brain. But before dismissing that, I think it's very important to see if there might be ways in which these subtle quantum effects can become amplified. There is a classic example where we know that amplification can take place, the superconductor. A superconductor occurs when, if you take a metal and cool it down to close to absolute zero, a perfect electric current can flow. And a superconductor can be big. But it is essentially a quantum phenomenon. It's an organisation of zillions of electrons to form a very coherent pattern as the electrons flow around the superconducting loop. And so they're manifesting on a macroscopic scale a quantum process that normally is restricted to this atomic scale. Maybe something like that is happening in the brain, but we really don't know.
To what extent is consciousness driven or made possible or even limited by language? And I include in that language the language of mathematics.
It's often said that our awareness of our own existence, this concept of selfhood, is intimately tied up with our use of language, and that if we didn't have language, we wouldn't really feel that we had this existence, this independent existence. This is one of these unanswerable problems, because supposing you came upon a being who was conscious of her or his own existence, or its own existence, but they couldn't tell you about it. Well, how would you know? How would you know what's going on in there? So there's something about the very nature of the problem that makes it unanswerable. I've always been sceptical about this view, that all it is that makes me aware of my own existence is my ability to tell you about it.
The first time I heard the term ghost in the machine, it wasn't in a treatise on Descartes, it was in a book by Arthur Koestler, who you'll recall had left the Communist Party and that rigid belief system and was floundering around trying to find another. And although we've promised to leave this discussion of religion or religious ideas to the last program, I remember him suggesting that the universe, in fact, was behaving like a great thought. The point you've made, that nothing is predetermined, that everything is sort of trying ideas out. Are you willing to entertain the possibility that there may be an ultimate consciousness?
I've made it very clear that I think that consciousness is something associated with complexity. And therefore I wouldn't expect to find that a rock is conscious, or for that matter that a star or a planet would be conscious. Consciousness is something that emerges. So it's very hard for me to see how there could be consciousness in the universe just after the Big Bang, for example, when everything was very hot and dense, but also very simple. When I use language like I see the need for some intellectual input in explaining the world, that, as we'll be talking about in the last episode, that there's something like meaning or purpose in the universe, I don't mean to convey the impression that this is like some sort of disembodied supermind performing miracles. But the idea that somehow some superintelligence or superconsciousness is moving stars and planets around and was doing so before humans came on the scene, I find ridiculous.
Whatever the prospects for cosmic consciousness, human consciousness has certainly had its triumphs, science and mathematics among them, helping us make sense of the world. But some scientists claim much more than this. They believe that they're capable of unravelling all the secrets of nature and thus comprehending the fundamental rules on which the universe runs. In the next episode, Paul and I ask whether there is a TOE, a theory of everything.